Okay, I think we can get started. So welcome everyone to another installment of webinars for busy lawyers, communicating your value as a lawyer, how to negotiate your salary with confidence. And this is part of our career series. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Alicia Ramsdell, momentarily. First, I'm Amy Levine, Director of Programs and Volunteers. I'm going to be your host for today. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to remind you of the confidential and free services we offer supporting the Massachusetts legal community. These services include one-on-one consultations with licensed clinicians for mental health and substance use concerns, peer support groups and clinician-facilitated groups, educational programs like this one, and one-on-one consultations with our law practice advisor on law firm management and professionalism. A few housekeeping notes. We love questions, so please feel free to submit those questions using our chat features, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Alicia is the founder and CEO of Mindful Career Path, where she helps professionals and organizations build more fulfilling careers while reducing burnout. A former public accounting and corporate finance leader, she combines executive coaching, career strategy, and mindfulness to help professionals and communicate their value with the confidence and make meaning of career decisions. Alicia has presented for organizations including PwC, Harvard University, Merck, 100 Women in Finance, Boston Women in Finance, and the Massachusetts Society of CPAs. Her work has been featured in TEDx, CBS Boston, and Fox 25 Boston. And she serves as an adjunct faculty member at Endicott College, where she teaches career development. And now I am going to hand it off to Alicia.
Thank you, Amy. I'm excited to be here and I look forward to getting started. I'm going to share my screen. Amy, can you see my screen? All right, we'll get started. I'd like you to think back to the last conversation that you had about your compensation. Maybe it was negotiating a new position. Maybe it was asking for a raise. Maybe it was discussing a promotion. The conversation ended, and then about an hour later, you thought of exactly what you should have said. The perfect example, the perfect response, the perfect question. Maybe for you, it happened on your drive home. Maybe it happened while you were walking your dog. Or maybe, like me many times, I think about that thing while I'm in the shower, where, let's be honest, all of our best ideas seem to happen. The perfect answer, just about an hour too late. Now, my guess is many of you aren't smiling because it's funny. You're smiling because you lived it. And what's fascinating is that this happens to some of the smartest professionals I know, including attorneys who negotiate on behalf of clients every single day. You negotiate contracts, you advocate for your clients, you solve complex problems, you negotiate on behalf of other people all the time. But when the conversation becomes about your own value, something changes. We hesitate, we second guess ourselves, we wonder, hey, are we asking for too much? Or we even convince ourselves that our hard work should simply speak for itself. Unfortunately, it rarely does. One of the things I love most about executive coaching is that regardless of someone's industry or their title, I tend to see the same patterns over and over again. I've coached professionals who were clearly underpaid, professionals who had taken on significantly more responsibility, professionals who had generated tremendous value for their organizations, And yet when it came time to have that compensation conversation, they suddenly became much better at advocating for everyone else than they were for themselves. They would minimize their accomplishments. They focused on how hard they worked instead of the value that they created. And they hoped somebody else would notice. Maybe you felt that way too. And that's really why I wanted to create today's session. Because after studying many of the world's leading experts in negotiation and communication, and after coaching hundreds of professionals through these conversations, I've realized something. The people who negotiate most successfully aren't necessarily better negotiators. They're better prepared. They understand their value. They communicate it clearly. And when the negotiation begins, they're not trying to figure out, what should I say next? They're simply presenting a case they've already built. That's exactly what I'd like to help you do today. Everything we're going to cover fits into a very simple 3-step framework. Know your value, communicate your value, negotiate your value. Each step builds on the one before it. Because here's what I've learned. Most people spend all of their time trying to become better negotiators. I actually think negotiation is the last step in the process. The best negotiations don't begin when someone says, let's talk about compensation. They begin weeks, even months earlier. They begin by understanding your value, building that evidence to support it, and learning how to communicate it with confidence. And that's the framework we're going to go through together today. So throughout today's session, you'll hear from a few of the world's leading experts in negotiation and communication. I intentionally included their perspectives because I wanted you to hear that this isn't simply one coach's opinion. So whether you're listening to Chris Voss or Kwame Christian or Bramley or any others, you'll notice something interesting. They all approach negotiation from different angles, but they consistently arrive at the same principles. So let's start with the foundation that makes everything else possible. Let's start with the foundation. Know your value. Here's where I think most professionals get negotiation completely backwards. They begin negotiation, or they believe negotiation begins when someone extends an offer. Congratulations, you got the job. Here's the offer. Or they believe it begins when they sit down with their manager to discuss compensation. I don't. I believe negotiation begins months before that conversation ever happens. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. Because negotiation isn't something that you're going to suddenly find in the moment. Confidence comes from preparation, and preparation starts with evidence. And evidence is something that lawyers know a lot about. As attorneys, this should sound very familiar. You never walk into a courtroom, you never negotiate a settlement or advise a client without first gathering the facts, without evidence. Yet when it comes to advocating for ourselves, so many professionals, they walk into a compensation conversation with one argument. I worked really hard. Now, the problem is that's not evidence. That's an opinion. So instead, I'd encourage you to think about this the same way you would prepare for an important case. You would build your case before you walk into the courtroom. There are 3 questions I want every professional to be able to answer. The first question, what is someone like you worth today? Notice I didn't ask, what do you currently make? Your current salary reflects one employer's decision at one point in time. It does not define your market value. Instead, let's take the emotion out of it and let the market guide you. So when we talk about market, I want you to look at resources like LinkedIn job postings, Glassdoor, or Robert Half's salary guide. It's new, it's interactive, and I think it's an excellent resource. And then I want you to validate what you're seeing through these resources by talking with legal recruiters, by talking with trusted colleagues, and by reviewing compensation surveys from bar associations or other legal associations. I usually recommend looking at 3 resources, and if they're all pointing to roughly the same range, that's no longer a guess. You're building your first piece of evidence. If I'll tell you something that I see all the time. Someone tells me, hey, I think I'm underpaid. My first question is always, compared to what? And sometimes they're absolutely right. They are underpaid. But sometimes they're already at market. But until we have that data, we're negotiating based on feelings instead of facts. So the second question is, why would someone pay you that amount? This is where most people make a critical mistake. They prepare a list of responsibilities. They start talking about everything they do, the projects they managed, the meetings that they managed or that they attended, the clients that they support. The problem is, employers don't pay for responsibilities. People don't invest in activities, they invest in outcomes. That's why simply describing your job and your responsibilities isn't enough. What decision makers really want to know is, what changed because you were there? What problems did you solve? Where did you reduce risk? What clients did you retain? What efficiencies did you create? Where did you step into leadership before anybody asked you to? Those are outcomes. Those are the things organizations invest in. Responsibilities, yes, they describe your role, but results demonstrate your value. And when you consistently communicate your results, you're going to make it much easier for someone else to recognize your value. And the third question, and this might be the most important, what makes you difficult to replace? So if you were to accept an opportunity tomorrow, what would your organization lose? Client relationships, institutional knowledge, leadership, specialized expertise, business development, trust, because that's often the hardest thing to replace. Those aren't just nice qualities. They're a part of your value proposition. And here's why those 3 questions matter. If you can confidently answer them today, or if you can't confidently answer them today, you're probably not ready to negotiate confidently yet. The good news, that's something that you can change. And one of the best ways to start building your case is by scheduling a reoccurring 30-minute meeting with yourself once a year. I call it your calendar value review. And I have one on my calendar, so I'm not asking you to do something I wouldn't do myself. Every year, because again, if I expect my clients to do it, I should be doing it too. Spend those 30 minutes updating your accomplishments, your measurable results, any new certifications that you may have or skills, your market salary data, any positive feedback that you've received from clients, from colleagues, or leadership. Apologize, my computer did something. But why do you want to do this? Because and you're not trying to remember everything you've done over the last 12 months. You've already built your case. So I'm curious. I just want you to drop one word in the chat. When was the last time that you actually researched your market value for your role? Not when you accepted your current position. When was the last time you intentionally looked? Just drop that in the chat right now.
Somebody already responded, never.
Oh, never. And that's typical and okay.
Somebody said, this is funny, just now because you said to do that.
So this is working. Excellent.
Somebody else said last week they had a comp talk this morning with their manager.
Okay. Well, this is exactly why this matters. Market value changes. Your experience changes. Your value changes. But too often, the story that we're telling ourselves doesn't. Now, one of the ideas that completely changed the way that I think about compensation came from Brandon Bramley. Now, he makes a point that I don't think enough professionals hear. Yes, employers post salary ranges, but where you land in that range isn't random. It's influenced by how you clearly demonstrate your value that you're going to bring. So let's listen quickly to how he explains it.
The big thing to know there, though, both as the employers are doing it and why you're seeing ranges as well as what the employees are seeing, is companies are still going to have a range. They do try not to pay everyone the same amount. The reason being is everyone's going to have different skill sets. They're trying to attract different talent that might be in different industries. So usually you'll have a base salary pay range as well as a total compensation range for every level and role at that company. But by going through the negotiation process, typically you can negotiate up towards the top end of that pay range if you can find a way to justify it. Because the best way to think about that too is at the end of the day, sometimes it doesn't matter who they hire. They're going to expect you to essentially do the same work as anyone else in that position, handle the same projects. So at the end of the day, you should be paid the same as anyone else.
I hadn't thought about that last point because sometimes when we do a range, in our mind, we're thinking about experience level. And it's like, okay, if we're going to get someone with more experience, we probably would go to the top end of that range. And I feel like I've had candidates come in and sort of just expect that they would end up at the top end of the range. So I think it's challenging as an employer. Like we're all still figuring this out and figuring out like what is the best approach. So I just wonder if you have any advice for the employers that are thinking about this. How would you want to see us do it in your perfect world?
Yeah, the advice is definitely, you should have a range, right? The big thing is no one wants to sit in a role where they don't have room to grow, right? We all like keeping our compensation, keeping up with inflation. We want to be able to get bonuses, different merits, items like that. And if you have a set role, everyone's kind of on that same playing field. So my recommendation, honestly, is to actually keep with the ranges, but then typically build it out more so, not necessarily years of experience, but typically based off of like the individual skill set that you're looking for, and maybe the individual projects, if you can, depending on your size of your company, of where it nets out, and dial that in to the compensation. But as you probably experienced as well, Stephanie, is it does get difficult if you are attracting different candidates from different companies with different incentives to go ahead and make sure you have that flexibility as well. The big thing to know there, though, both as the employers are doing it and why you're seeing ranges as well as what the employees are seeing, is companies are still going to have a range. They do try not to pay everyone the same amount.
So I love that perspective because it reminds us of something important. Range isn't the opportunity, your preparation is. The more clearly you can connect your experience, your results, and the future impact to what the organization needs, the stronger your position becomes. That's not arrogance. That's preparation. That's evidence. And that's building your case. So once you've done the work to understand your value, the next challenge isn't knowing it, it's helping someone else see it. And that's where most professionals struggle. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next, communicating your value.
The big thing to know there, though, both.
So now that you've done the work to understand your value, the next challenge is communicating it. And I actually think this is where most professionals struggle. Knowing your value is one thing. Communicating it, especially under pressure, is something entirely different. Have you ever walked into an important conversation and you suddenly forgot everything you planned to say? Your heart starts racing, your mouth gets dry, your thoughts feel scattered. Then you walk out of the conversation and suddenly the perfect answer shows up. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. It's one of the most common things I hear from coaching clients. And there's a reason for it. It's simply how our brains respond under pressure. So one of my favorite ideas comes from Kwame Christian, and he talks about what happens when our brain perceives a conversation as high stakes. Again, your heart races, your breathing changes, so your body starts preparing for action. And most of us commonly interpret those signals as anxiety. But here's what's fascinating. Physiologically, anxiety and excitement look almost identical. And the difference isn't your body, it's the story that you're telling yourself. So the next time that you feel your heart racing before a compensation conversation, instead of thinking, I'm nervous, try telling yourself, you know what? I'm excited because this conversation matters. It's a small shift, but it changes how you show up. I one time had a coaching client tell me, the moment my manager tells me, let's talk about compensation, my mind goes completely blank. So we practiced something incredibly simple. Before every important conversation, I had asked her, pause, take one small breath, put both your feet on the floor, relax your shoulders, and then remind yourself, I don't have to prove my worth today. I'm here to communicate it. That simple mindset shift completely changed how she entered these types of conversations. Once you go ahead and regulate yourself, now the real communication begins. And one of the most valuable concepts I've learned from Kwame Christian is something he calls compassionate curiosity. So great negotiators don't begin with, hey, I'm going to start making all these demands. They begin by asking thoughtful questions. They start to become curious before they become persuasive. So instead of trying to win, they're going to try to understand the other side. So here are 2 techniques I try to encourage every client to practice. First, ask open-ended questions. So instead of immediately making your case, start with curiosity. Questions like, can you help me understand how this compensation range was determined? Or what qualities would someone need to demonstrate to be at the top of this range? Notice what that question does. Instead of arguing about today's salary, you're gathering information about tomorrow's opportunity. Those questions create dialogue instead of defensiveness. And the second thing I ask is that you reflect before you respond. So let's say your manager says, hey, our budget's tight this year. Resist the urge to immediately defend yourself. Instead, you can respond with something like, so if I'm hearing you correctly, budget is fixed this cycle, but there may be flexibility during the next review. Is that right? It's a simple technique, but when people feel heard, they're more willing to solve the problem with you instead of against you. I think Kwame explained this concept better than anyone, so let's listen to how he describes compassionate curiosity.
So for me, from the discoveries that we had from the over 1,500 episodes, it led us to create compassionate curiosity and make it more robust. So it's a mental model that allows you to flow through any difficult conversation, whether you're at work or at home. So I use it with my kids. I use it with my wife. I use it when I'm negotiating 6-figure deals for the American Negotiation Institute and consulting on multi-million-dollar deals too. It is the foundation. And the majority of our conversations, probably 90 to 95% of it, can be handled exclusively through compassionate curiosity. Then if it's more technical and complex, we can sprinkle in a little bit more on top of it. So I'll give 2 quotes and then I'll get into it. So quote number 1, Leonardo da Vinci, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Mm-hmm. And so I want to make this as simple as possible without being simplistic, because I know that under duress, people aren't going to put together a complicated strategy. But if you give them something really simple that they can hold on to, now it makes it more likely for them to actually use it. Absolutely. And then Bruce Lee said, I don't fear the man who knows 10,000 kicks. I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. and this is
a great quote.
Right? And it makes so much sense here, because here with compassionate curiosity, it's never a question of whether or not it applies. It's just a question of how. And so it allows you to make the right read and know what to say and when to say it for maximum impact. So it's a 3-step process. Number 1, if we recognize that there are challenging emotions in the room, we're going to acknowledge and validate the emotions. So simply just label the emotion, emotional labeling, validating, letting them know that we understand where they're coming from, and going through that process until the emotional temperature goes down so we can see, okay, the amygdala is quieting and the frontal lobe is activating. That's what we're looking for. And then the second step is getting curious with compassion. So asking open-ended questions with a compassionate tone. That's why I called it compassionate curiosity, because the tone matters when it comes to building trust. Like a lawyer doing a cross-examination, I guess technically is curious, but certainly not going to elicit, compassionate at all, and not going to get the vulnerability, because they can't create the psychological safety. And then the last step is using joint problem solving. So it's not me versus you, it's you and me versus the problem. And we're going to use future focused problem solving, where grammatically we're going to focus on a future oriented conversation, because a lot of mistrust, judgment, resentment, and anger exist in the past. So shifting that tense to the future helps us. So if there's no emotional challenge, then we just skip to step 2. If we're in step 3 and emotions come up, we then go to step 1. It's very flexible. And when you see it, there's nothing truly revolutionary about it. It's the things that we've known in psychology and negotiation for a long time: labeling, curiosity, and working together, but putting it into a flow so people can actually identify it in a conversation and know what to say and when to say it. And then the last thing that's powerful is that It is designed for external negotiations as well as internal negotiations. So before the conversation, if I'm triggered and emotional, I'm going through the same framework. I'm labeling my own emotions. I'm getting curious with self-directed compassion to figure out why I feel the way that I feel. And then I'm figuring out, using step 3, what should I actually do that is fair to me and my emotions and satisfies my emotional need while at the same time addressing the problem. So it's a dual framework, but again, with the simplicity of just 3 steps every time. So for me, from the discoveries that we had from...
One of the things that I appreciate about Kwame's approach is that it reminds us negotiation doesn't have to feel adversarial. It can feel collaborative. The goal doesn't have to beat the other person. The goal is to solve a problem together. And that's a completely different mindset. So here's another coaching observation. Most professionals will communicate their value by describing what they do. They say, hey, I manage this project. I supervise this team. I handled this client. Now, there's nothing wrong with those statements, but they're describing activities that you've done. And employers aren't investing in activities. They're investing in your outcomes. That's a phrase I want you to remember throughout today's session. People don't invest in activities. They invest in outcomes. They want to know what changed because you were there. Let me give you a simple example from my own business. If someone were to ask me, what do? I could simply say, coach executives. Now, while that's true, it doesn't really communicate the value that I create. So a stronger way for me to say that would be, I've helped hundreds of professionals negotiate their careers with greater confidence by giving them practical frameworks that they can apply immediately. Do you hear that difference? That first sentence tells you what I do, which is fine, but that second one tells you the outcome that I can help create. And that's exactly the shift that I want you to make. Whether you're interviewing, whether you're asking for a raise or discussing a promotion, don't just tell people your responsibilities, tell them your results. So instead of saying I managed a cross-functional project, you could say, hey, I led a cross-functional project that reduced turnaround time by this % and saved the team nearly this many hours each week. Instead of saying something like, I handled client relationships, you could say, I strengthened client relationships, contributing to this percentage of, client retention rate. Because remember, again, people don't invest in those activities. They're going to invest in your outcomes. And the more clearly you can communicate the outcomes that you've created, the easier it becomes for somebody to recognize your value. And one final tip before we move into negotiation. Before I walk into an important conversation today, one of my favorite preparation tools is actually AI. I usually will upload a job description, I'll upload my resume, and then I'll ask AI to be my hiring manager. Hey, ask me challenging questions. Ask me or push back on my requests when I answer. Tell me where my answers are too long. Tell me where maybe I'm underselling myself. It's one of the safest places to practice. Remember that your confidence isn't just going to come from reading about negotiation. It's going to come from actually rehearsing it. And AI allows you and myself to rehearse it before conversations ever happen. So we've talked about understanding your value. We've talked about communicating your value. And now it's time for the final step. How do you actually negotiate the value when the conversation begins? And that's where I'd like to spend the final few minutes together. So far, we talked today about understanding your value, building your evidence that supports that case, and communicating your value with confidence. And now comes the moment that most people think of when they hear the word negotiation, the actual conversation. And here's what I'd like you to remember. If you've done everything we've talked about so far, you're not walking into that conversation hoping to convince somebody that you're valuable. You're walking in fully prepared to discuss the value that you've already demonstrated. And that's a very different mindset. One of the biggest misconceptions about negotiation is that somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. I don't believe that. I think the best negotiations aren't competitions. They're going to be collaborations. They're conversations where two people are working together towards a shared solution. And that's why I encourage clients to replace one question. Instead of asking, how do I get more? Ask, how do we create a solution that works for both of us? And that one shift changes the entire tone of the conversation. So let's imagine that you're told, unfortunately, we can't increase the salary. Now, most people immediately stop negotiating, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. Curiosity can give us and you another option. You might respond with something like, can you help me understand what's driving that decision? Or if salary isn't flexible today, what other parts of the offer might be? Maybe it's professional development. Maybe it's additional, paid time off. Maybe it's a signing bonus. Maybe it's a 6-month salary review. Maybe it's a hybrid work schedule. Great negotiators understand something important. Rarely is there only one variable. Compensation is much bigger than salary. And sometimes the most valuable part about the offer itself isn't the actual number. It's the opportunity. Ask yourself, what's the most important to me? Is it growth? Is it flexibility? Is it mentorship? Is it leadership opportunities? What about professional development? A better work-life integration? The clearer you are about your priorities, the easier it becomes to negotiate the entire package instead of focusing on just one number. Notice that none of those strategies require you to become more aggressive. They simply require you to be better prepared. Now, I had another video with perspective from Steve Shull, and he talks about approaching these conversations. In the essence of time, I'm going to move on from it. But what I will do is I will share it with Amy, and Amy will distribute it to everyone here and everyone registered for this webinar. So I'll show you that soon. But one thing that I really like about Steve's perspective is that he reminds us that confidence isn't about controlling the other person. It's about controlling yourself, staying calm, staying curious, staying focused on solving the problem instead of winning the argument. And that's where of all of the preparation that we've talked about so far really pays off. One final thought, and sometimes even after you prepare, and maybe you don't want to hear any of this, but even after you've communicated your value effectively, the answer is still no. And that's okay. A no doesn't always mean you're not valuable. Sometimes it's going to mean a budget is fixed. The timing just isn't right. Or there are other organizational constraints that you simply can't see. Please don't ever confuse the rejection with your worth. Instead, I want you to stay curious. I want you to ask, what would I need to demonstrate over the next 6 months for us to revisit this conversation? That's one of the most powerful questions that you can ask. Because what you're doing is you're turning a disappointing conversation into a development plan. I had a client who didn't receive the increase that she was hoping for. So what she could have done is walk away completely frustrated, which, I wouldn't blame her if she did. But instead she asked, what would success look like before we revisit this conversation? And together they identified, her and the manager identified 3 measurable goals specifically for her. 6 months later, she came back with the evidence that she measured those goals. She exceeded the expectations. There was no emotion. And this time, the outcome was different. That's what the power of preparation has. That's the power of staying curious. And that's the power of negotiating with clarity instead of reacting in the moment.
I come from a corporate background of bid management.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with one challenge this week. I want you to schedule that 30 minutes with yourself. I want you to put that recurring meeting on your calendar annually. I want you to call it your career value review. And then I want you to spend that time asking yourself, what outcomes did I create? What problems did I solve? Where did I make someone else's job easier? And what evidence have I built that demonstrates my value? Because here's what I've learned, through coaching hundreds of professionals. The people who walk into compensation conversations with the most confidence, they aren't the people who are the most charismatic. They aren't the loudest in the room. They aren't even the best negotiators. They're just simply the best prepared. And at the beginning of today's session, I asked you to think about that conversation where about an hour later, you finally thought of exactly what you wish you had said. Again, maybe it happened in the car. Maybe it happened while you were walking the dog. Or maybe, like me, it happened in the shower. My hope is that the next time you walk into one of those conversations, you won't spend the drive home replaying what you wish you would have said, because you'll already know. You'll have built your case. You'll know the outcomes that you've created. You'll know how to communicate your value, and you're going to walk away from that conversation with confidence. And it's not because, hey, I've memorized the perfect words and I memorized the perfect answer, but it's because you've done that preparation. And throughout today's session, we've talked about understanding your value. We've talked about communicating your value and negotiating your value. But if there's one idea that I hope stays with you after we log off today, it's that, again, people don't invest in activities. They invest in outcomes. And the best negotiators or the best negotiations don't begin when someone says, hey, let's talk about compensation. They begin long before that conversation ever happens. I want to, again, thank you for taking your time to be here, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Alicia, this was fantastic. I think incredibly helpful information. And just something that really resonated with me was that this shouldn't be an adversarial type of conversation. There's no win or lose. It is having a conversation and asking these thoughtful questions to really start it out. And again, that's what really was so, I think, another big message to emphasize. I also wanted to just mention, and you mentioned the Robert Half survey. It is free for folks to download. Yes, you have to put in your contact information, so expect a phone call. And you can say yes, no to their help, but it is a great resource. There's, I'm sure, other agencies that also have this information, but Robert Half is a great resource, and also contacting recruiters. They're the ones that really have their finger on the pulse. So that's some great information. We do have a couple of questions that I want to put out to you. So this one is a long one. How do you know when to stop pushing in the negotiation? What are the signals? This person had the unfortunate experience where they were inching towards an offer, and as the employer invoked me to do and discussed alternative demands like a flexible schedule, The potential employer's rep said, essentially, there are so many people who want this job as is, I do not have to bend over for you, and ended the negotiation. What's your comment on that?
Yeah. First of all, I think that I guess actions in a sense speak volumes. So if that's the perspective and that's, how they're going to take it, you can decide if that's an organization that you want to work for or not. Now, with that being said, I believe that through the preparation, knowing your, non-negotiables, your priorities in if a salary gets to this point, great, within this range. If not, what else would be satisfying for me? Would it be more paid time off, or the other things, right? So I would have all your ducks in a row before the conversation. They're going to come to you with an offer. The expectation is you will negotiate with the salary. The salary doesn't come back the way you want it. I would say, great, understand salary doesn't work. Where can we meet? Can we meet somewhere on these? Let them make that decision. And I think at that point, that's where you stop. And it's not because you shouldn't push for yourself anymore. I just believe you already have done the work. You know exactly what you want. So I just think here's the offer. Here's what I'm negotiating for my salary. Here's their response. If it doesn't meet your expectations, can we meet here? And if they at that point say no, already that's my walk away point. Or I'm okay with that and I'm going to accept it. But all of that preparation will lead you to know where you stand. And that actually is the Steve Shull video that I will share with you. It talks about his favorite or fool tool. And it's just knowing, are you the favorite in the conversation or the fool in the conversation? Fool, lightly termed, meaning are you just a part of the conversations, but they already have somebody else in mind? So when I share that audio, I hope that would be more helpful, and happy to discuss further with you if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. And I think you made this point in the beginning. I think the way that recruiter or whomever that was said that to this person, I think that's a great sign to say, do I really want to work here if that's how they're going to speak to me? So again, you have that choice too, to walk away. And I think that sometimes is a really good indicator. Do you really want to work there if that's, again, how somebody's going to speak to you? Comment, thank you so much. This was amazing and timely for me as I'm currently trying to figure out how to create a new position in my department. And we do have another question. So this person had the talk this morning with their manager, and they had a powerful data point. A posting that went up last week with this person's title, but servicing a different group, and this person works in-house. But the role had significant overlap in terms of experience and some of the job functions. Their manager was unaware of the posting, even though they mentioned it last week in the email requesting the meeting, but said essentially that the two groups were compensated differently, even though the role itself had the same titles. I stayed focused on the overlap between the two roles. Should this person have done more? They didn't discuss my contributions during this initial discussion with him. So should they have done more?
So correct me if I'm wrong, the initial discussion was exploring the opportunity, but not necessarily having applied for it yet. Is that correct?
Let's see, posting went up last week, role significant overlap, manager unaware. Oh, it was exploring a comp adjustment. Thank you to that person.
Oh, thank you. So a comp adjustment for the current role that they were in. Yeah, so as far as a comp adjustment goes, I mean, it's very similar to what I was sharing before, exploring the market value, knowing what you're worth, and bringing the evidence. It seems like in the initial conversation, there was no real push. It was more about compassionate curiosity from your end. And now that you've gathered potentially the information that you were looking for, now build your case and then go back. to confirm what evidence you brought back for that compensation adjustment. But in that initial conversation, it sounds as though the compassionate curiosity is how you played it. And then now you build your case, the evidence, and then go into that conversation with where you believe you should be at. Is that helpful? Did that answer the question? And if not, please share it in the chat.
Just keeping an eye. Sometimes it takes a little bit for somebody to
That's
type.
okay. Yes.
So while they're typing or responding, so if you were in that conversation, can you provide an example how you might actually say that? And just as, again, an example of really real life, how do you phrase that? Oh, by the way, the person did say, I think so. He said he would make the ask and see what he says if I can have an opportunity to provide that additional evidence.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great last statement there, is providing that additional, if you can provide that additional evidence. Now, going through everything we went today, let's say you had started that value review and you had all this information prepared. What I typically recommend to clients is after they have an initial conversation, I recommend that they provide in the follow-up thank you with a 1-pager or a 3-page slide deck that follows up with the conversation highlights, as well as the evidence built around what their case is, and the ask, and a meeting request for 2 weeks later, however far out you believe is appropriate for your industry and for your organization. That way, they have time to digest it on their end, as well as share it among their team if they feel that that's the right fit. That allows them to come back with the conversation with their own perspective after having conversations and knowing exactly where they stand. And if you are, a favorite in the conversation, that's when you know that they're going to be willing to make that adjustment. I also think it really depends on the organization you're in. I think there are certain organizations, specifically larger organizations, that are very strict as far as, when raises and promotions go through, and, the certain grade levels, depending on your title. So this is all based on knowing where you are or knowing where you're interviewing and their specific compensation increase calendar opportunities. But I really do, and I've seen I really do like, and I see a lot of positive feedback when people prepare that 1-pager with the evidence base there.
So one of the things, so I used to be a legal recruiter, and I know legal recruiters sometimes will say when they're interviewing and they're asked that question, what kind of salary are you looking for? Now, on one hand, now Massachusetts does require the posting of the salary range, but we used to advise, and other recruiters would advise, well, I am flexible, I am negotiable, but it depends on the compensation package, or the compensation package really plays a part. What do you think of that? How do you respond to that response?
Yeah, sure, that's a great question. Typically for clients, if they're going into an interview, especially when it's the initial phone screening, and if they ask for your compensation range, if they ask for the compensation range first, I'll suggest that a client responds back with, while I'm getting to learn more about this opportunity throughout the interview process, I will, have a better idea of what compensation meets, the value that this candidate will bring and the responsibilities that are required. Do you have a range that the organization is considering at this time? And allow them to share the range. Now, if the range is something that in your head is agreeable and you think this is fair and just, then you can say, yep, that is in line with what I was looking for from a salary range. And you can continue the conversation. Some will push back and say, unfortunately, we cannot provide that, and you should know whether the state should be allowing you to know that information ahead of time. But if they're going to push back and the state doesn't require them to share that salary, then I would give a range, but again, based on the evidence that you've provided. And again, I would look at 3 resources and then try to tie it back with conversations with legal recruiters or information from the bar association, or our trusted colleague. And if they're all within the same range, I think you know better than anybody what the expectation should be.
And I think you make a good point. These conversations can change depending on who you're speaking to. So if you're in the initial stage where you're speaking to the HR person and you're not speaking to the actual hiring manager or attorney that you'll be working with, again, those answers can change because it might not be as you said, the most appropriate time to talk about all of your accomplishments with this recruiter when they're doing, again, the initial screening and they're just trying to make sure you meet certain criteria. And it might be a 15-minute conversation, it might be a 30-minute conversation. So again, it depends on who you're speaking with too. I think that it sounds like that has an impact.
Absolutely. And for the audience and for anyone that registered, even if they weren't able to attend today, I did create a compensation case document that walks through the framework that we discussed today. And I'll send it to you in PDF as well as in Word, and you can input your own information, and it's private for you to have and for you to use going forward in compensation conversations and for your career value review. And it goes through the evidence and so forth and how to have those conversations. So that's one thing I created. I'm also really excited about AI and creating apps for my own business, Mindful Career Path. So what I did for this audience was I created an app called the Compensation Case. It's free. You can log in. Everything is private to you. And then it goes through step by step, again, the framework we went through. Now it is completely brand new, not fully tested. So you are welcome to see it, kind of be beta testers, and let me know your thoughts on it, or if anything you like or dislike about it. And I'd happy to hear your feedback and make changes. But again, another way for you to do this and practice these compensation conversations, build that evidence, build that case before you walk into the room.
And what was the name of that app again?
So I call it the compensation case. It's called the Lawyer Value app, for lack of a better term. I'm working with the name of the app, but I can share that link with you at the end of this so that you can share it with the audience.
That's excellent. Okay. That sounds interesting. And again, it's nice, right, when you can provide feedback. And so it improves the product. But again, this was really wonderful. I think, as I had written in some of my promotions, lawyers are great at negotiating for clients. But sometimes when it's negotiating for themselves, it changes things. And sometimes the money aspect is uncomfortable. And sometimes it has to do with your upbringing and how you feel about that. But it sounds like I think this helps overcome some of those pieces. Again, building your case in advance. So we do have somebody who said, thank you for a very informative and enlightening webinar. Again, yes, I agree. This was really, again, educational, terrific. Just as a reminder, you will receive the recording shortly after this ends, and as well as we're going to send you the slides, and then Alicia will send over that link to that app if you want to give it a try. So thank you so much for everybody for joining us. Thank you to Alicia for, again, a wonderful program, and we were just out of time. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.